Julian Street. Claire didn't build his empire by overpaying. As one of the most feared men in the city's underworld, he knew how to spot a lie, a bargain, and a trap. So when he bought an old cabin for $25, he knew immediately something was wrong. Not because the land was worthless, but because no one else wanted it. The foreclosure auction should have been loud, competitive, hungry. Instead, it was silent. Men with cash in their pockets stood frozen as Julian raised his hand. No counterbids, no murmurs, no jokes about stealing land for pocket change. The auctioneer hesitated longer than protocol allowed, his gavel hovering in midair like he was silently asking Julian to stop. When the sale closed, the sound cracked through the room unnaturally. No one congratulated him. No one smiled. They just stared. It took Julian a second to understand what he was seeing on their faces. It wasn't anger or jealousy. It was pity. A man near the back muttered, "Another one," before going quiet. An older woman crossed herself. Someone else turned away entirely, like watching the aftermath of an accident they'd already seen before. If you've ever wondered what people are afraid to talk about, stay with me. Julian asked the clerk about the cabin's history. The man slid the deed across the table with shaking hands and refused to meet his eyes. No explanation. No warning. Just relief, as if the problem had finally become someone else's. The drive out to the property felt wrong from the start. The road narrowed, the grass grew wild, cell service vanished, and by the time Julian stepped out of his car, the cabin stood alone in the open field like it had been deliberately placed there to be found and avoided. The damage wasn't random. The windows were shattered from the inside, bullet holes scarred the logs, and the front door stood open, chained shut from within. That's when Julian understood the truth. The cabin wasn't abandoned, it had been closed, and whatever lay beyond that door wasn't just a secret. It was something powerful men had paid to erase, something tied to disappearances, something that, if exposed, could cost Julian his fortune, his allies, or his life. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Julian had spent his entire career keeping doors closed, and this was the first one he couldn't afford to walk away from. The cabin was smaller, up close than it had looked from the road, but that didn't make it less unsettling. If anything, the closeness made the details impossible to ignore. Julian Street Clare stood just outside the doorway, letting his eyes do what they had always done best. Measure, calculate, reconstruct history from fragments men thought they had erased. This wasn't rot. This wasn't neglect. The logs were old, yes, but solid. Someone had replaced weakened beams instead of letting them fail. The roof sagged in places, yet the supports beneath were reinforced, almost obsessively. Whoever maintained this place hadn't been careless. They had been deliberate. Julian stepped inside, the chain on the door clinking softly as it shifted. The sound echoed longer than it should have in such a small space. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that was when the story began to reveal itself. The windows weren't broken by storms. The glass shards lay inward, scattered across the floor in a way Julian recognized instantly. Forced exits, desperation, people trying to get out, not keep others from getting in. Bullet holes dotted the walls at shoulder height, not random, not wild. They formed lines, measured spacing, controlled fire, training, execution. Julian exhaled slowly through his nose. He had seen rooms like this before, back when his empire was still learning what it meant to silence problems. A cabin like this didn't exist by accident. Near the far wall, iron rings were bolted directly into the logs. One had been torn loose, leaving behind splintered wood and rust-stained scars. Another remained intact, its metal worn smooth from repeated strain. Wrists, ankles. Time spent fighting restraints. Julian crouched, brushing his fingers over the floorboards. They were scratched deeply in places, gouged as if something heavy had been dragged across them again and again. There were faint discolorations, too. Cleaned too well, too thoroughly, as though someone had scrubbed until the wood itself gave up its memory. This place hadn't been abandoned. It had been sanitized. The air carried a smell Julian didn't like. Old oil. Damp metal. Fear that never fully leaves a room, no matter how long it's empty. He straightened slowly, feeling something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. Whoever built this cabin hadn't needed it anymore. That was why it had been sold. Not because it was harmless, but because it had outlived its usefulness. Julian moved toward the chained interior door, stopping just short of touching it. The lock was newer than the rest of the cabin. Recently replaced. Maintained. Someone still cared about what stayed behind that door. For the first time since the auction, Julian understood the real cost of the $25 he'd spent. This wasn't a property. It was a grave that refused to stay buried. And the longer he stood there, the clearer it became. Walking away now wouldn't make him safe. It would only make him next. Julian had learned long ago that doors told the truth, long before people did. This one confirmed everything he'd been trying not to think. The interior door sat slightly off-center, its frame embedded deeper into the logs than the rest of the cabin. Not an afterthought. Not a repair. It had been built that way on purpose. Julian ran his hand along the wood, feeling the density beneath his fingers. Reinforced from the inside. Layered. Whoever installed it had expected pressure. Kicks, blows, panic. The chain was thick, industrial grade, looped through steel brackets bolted straight into the wall. Not nailed. Bolted. The metal was worn smooth in places, polished by friction and time. Julian didn't need imagination to know why. People had pulled on this chain until their strength failed. Then they'd pulled some more. The lock itself was newer than everything else. Recently oiled, recently checked. Someone had come back here. Not to open it, but to make sure it stayed closed. Julian stepped back, scanning the room again. The placement of the door wasn't logical for storage. It cut the cabin in a way that wasted space, blocked light, trapped air. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about separation. Containment. He noticed the floor near the door next. The boards were darker there, worn unevenly, as if feet had paced the same short distance over and over. No windows faced that section of the cabin. No way to tell day from night. Julian swallowed slowly. He had built rooms like that once, rooms designed to erase time. The realization settled heavy in his chest. This door wasn't meant to keep intruders out. It was meant to keep someone in. Julian knelt and examined the hinges. They were mounted on the far side, inside the sealed space. A subtle detail, a cruel one. Even if the lock failed, even if the chain snapped, the door wouldn't open outward. Whoever was trapped behind it would still be pushing against their own prison. He straightened slowly, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. This wasn't a forgotten relic of violence. It was a system, a procedure, a place designed for people who were never supposed to leave, and whose absence would never be questioned. For the first time since stepping onto the property, Julian felt something close to anger. Not at the men who had built this. He understood them too well. He was angry at the assumption. The assumption that the secret was still safe. That whoever bought the cabin would either be too afraid or too smart to look closer. That the door would remain closed because fear had always been cheaper than truth. Julian reached out and rested his palm against the wood, feeling the cold resistance beneath it. He didn't open the door. Not yet. But in that moment, one thing became clear. This cabin hadn't been sold because its secret was harmless. It had been sold because someone believed the last man capable of opening that door would never dare to try. And Julian St. Clair had never survived by obeying assumptions. The warning didn't come with sirens or gunfire. It arrived quietly, the way serious things always did. Julian was locking up the cabin when he noticed the truck idling at the edge of the property. It hadn't been there a moment earlier. Old model, dust-coated, engine running, but the driver made no move to get out. just waited. Julian didn't reach for his weapon. He walked toward it instead. The man behind the wheel was local. Mid-50s, sun-beaten skin, eyes that had learned to look past people rather than at them. He stepped out slowly, hands visible, posture respectful in a way that wasn't fear. It was practice. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, not unkindly, "and you won't want to stay." Julian smiled faintly. "Funny, I just bought the place." The man nodded, as if that explained everything. He reached into the truck and pulled out a small duffel bag, setting it gently on the hood. The zipper opened just enough for Julian to see what was inside. Cash. Stacks of it. Neat. Clean. Unmarked. 10 times what you paid, the man said. "Right now. No names. No signatures. You walk away, and this stops being your problem." Julian didn't look at the money. He watched the man's face instead. There was no greed there, no excitement, just urgency layered over something darker. "And if I don't?" Julian asked. The man hesitated. That was the tell. "Then it becomes complicated," he said carefully. "People start asking why you didn't listen, why you thought you were different." Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Different from who?" The man swallowed. "From the last ones." That single word carried more weight than any threat. Julian felt it settle in his chest, heavy and cold. He glanced back at the cabin, the broken windows, the chained door, the land that had been sold and resold for nothing like a curse no one could shake. "No paperwork?" Julian asked. The man shook his head. "Never was." "And you?" Julian said. "Why are you here?" The man's jaw tightened. "Because I owe someone who can't speak anymore, and because after today I don't want to owe anyone else." Julian finally looked at the cash. Then he zipped the bag closed and pushed it back across the hood. "Tell them I'm not selling," he said. The man's shoulders sagged, like he'd expected that answer, and still hoped it wouldn't come. He climbed back into his truck without another word. As the engine faded down the dirt road, Julian stood alone in the open field, the silence heavier than before. The warning had been clear. The offer had been generous, and the absence of paperwork told him everything. This wasn't about land. It was about erasing mistakes before they started talking. Julian turned back toward the cabin, knowing one thing for certain now. The door wasn't the only thing that had been sealed. The moment he refused that money, so was his fate. Julian didn't sleep that night. He drove back into town instead, parking beneath a flickering streetlight outside a county records office that looked like it had been forgotten on purpose. Places like this always were. The kind of buildings meant to hold answers long after people stopped asking questions. Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust and something else. Resignation. Julian moved through filing cabinets with practiced patience, fingers steady, mind sharp. He wasn't searching randomly. He was tracing ownership. The cabin's name appeared more often than it should have. Different deeds, different years, same property, same land boundaries, same handwritten notes in the margins. Foreclosed, reclaimed, sold for pennies, sold again. Every transfer quick, quiet, final. Julian began writing the names down. The first owner had held the cabin less than a year, the second, 6 months, the third, barely 3 weeks. Each file ended the same way, with incomplete paperwork and a thin, awkward silence where follow-up records should have been. No wills, no probate, no relocation forms. People didn't move on from this place. They vanished. Julian cross-checked dates with local obituaries. Nothing. He searched missing persons reports next. The names surfaced there instead, scattered across different counties, different states, always just vague enough to avoid attention. Adults with no close family, drifters, contractors, one former accountant, another a parole officer, people whose absence could be explained if no one looked too closely. But Julian did. A pattern emerged. Every disappearance followed a familiar rhythm. New ownership, brief occupancy, a final sighting near the cabin. Then nothing. No bodies, no investigations, no answers. He leaned back slowly, the weight of it settling into his bones. This wasn't coincidence. It was process. The cabin wasn't cursed, it was efficient. Julian found one final name that made him pause. A man who had technically never owned the property, yet appeared repeatedly in handwritten notes across several files. Initials only. No address, no date of birth. Just the same notation scribbled beside each transfer. Handled. Julian closed the folder. The realization came quietly, but it cut deep. The cabin wasn't just a place where people disappeared. It was a test. Anyone curious enough to buy it, brave enough to inspect it, greedy or confident enough to keep it, was automatically flagged. Ownership wasn't the mistake. Interest was. Julian glanced at the list of names again, then folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket. He felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not regret, but resolve. These people hadn't been unlucky. They'd been silenced. And now Julian St. Clair's name was the next one attached to that address. The difference was simple. He didn't disappear. He documented. Julian made the call from a payphone that still smelled faintly of metal and old smoke. He hadn't used one in years, but some habits never lost their value. The number he dialed wasn't saved anywhere. It didn't need to be. The voice on the other end went quiet when Julian said where he was. "You bought that place?" the man asked finally. "I did." A long pause followed. Not the kind caused by bad reception, but by memory. "Then you shouldn't be standing there," the voice said, "and I shouldn't be talking to you." Julian named the cabin, the land, the chained door. The man exhaled sharply. "They told us it was decommissioned." "Told who?" Julian asked. "People like me," the man replied. "People who handled things before they became problems." They met later that night in a diner off the highway, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects that never slept. The man looked older than Julian remembered. Smaller, the kind of man who'd survived by knowing when to step aside. "You won't find blueprints," he said, stirring coffee he never drank. "And you won't find official records, because it wasn't official." Julian didn't interrupt. "It was a holding site," the man continued. "Not a prison, not a grave. A pause, for people who couldn't be arrested, couldn't be paid off, couldn't be allowed to talk." "Unregistered," Julian said. The man nodded. "Exactly." He explained how the cabin sat outside jurisdictional overlap, how no agency wanted responsibility for it, how certain names, politicians, financiers, crime bosses, preferred solutions that never reached a courtroom. "They didn't bring people there to kill them," the man said quietly. "At least not at first. They brought them there to wait." "Wait for what?" Julian asked. "For someone to decide," he replied. "Sometimes that decision came quickly. Sometimes it didn't come at all." Julian thought of the iron rings, the pacing marks on the floor, the reinforced door. "Why sell it?" Julian asked. The man looked away. "Because people started asking questions, and because the men who built it are either dead or scared." He leaned forward then, lowering his voice. "If you open that door, you won't just find proof. You'll find obligations, debts, names tied to power that still breathes." Julian stood to leave. "And if I don't?" The man's eyes met his. "Then they'll assume you're smart enough to stay silent, and silence is safer. For them." Julian left the diner without another word. By the time he returned to the cabin, dawn was breaking. He stood inside the quiet structure, walls heavy with truths no one wanted remembered. The cabin wasn't just a place where people were kept. It was a place where responsibility was postponed. And Julian St. Clair had just realized something dangerous. once you knew where unregistered problems went. You became one too. The first vehicle appeared just after sunset. Julian noticed it from the cabin window, a pair of headlights parked too far back on the dirt road to be accidental. Engine off. No movement. Just presence. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't turn off the lights. He waited. By nightfall, there were 3. They arrived without urgency, without noise, spacing themselves with professional precision. One near the tree line. One closer to the road. One somewhere behind the cabin, unseen but felt. Julian recognized the pattern instantly. Containment, not confrontation. He stepped onto the porch slowly, hands visible, posture relaxed. The air had changed. It always did before violence. Thicker, expectant. A man's voice carried from the darkness, calm, polite, almost apologetic. "You've done enough," the voice said. "Walk away tonight and this ends clean." Julian smiled faintly. "Clean for who?" A second voice answered this time, closer. "For you." A flashlight beam cut across the ground but never quite reached his face. They were careful not to see him too clearly. Plausible distance, plausible deniability. "You didn't buy real estate," the first voice continued. "You bought something that was never meant to change hands. That door stays closed. The land goes quiet again. Everyone lives." "And if I don't?" Julian asked. Silence stretched. Long enough to feel deliberate. "Then you join the list," the man said. "The ones people forget because it's easier that way." Julian glanced back into the cabin, at the reinforced door that had outlived every owner before him. He thought of the names in the records, the iron rings, the men who had waited for decisions that never came. "You're assuming I want to be forgotten," Julian said. A figure stepped closer to the edge of the light now. Tall, armed, efficient, not local, not sentimental. "You don't get to decide how this ends," the man said. "That choice was made years ago." Julian felt the truth of it settle in his chest, not as fear, but as clarity. This wasn't a negotiation. It was maintenance. They were here to reset the balance. He straightened, voice steady. "You came here expecting compliance." The man didn't answer. "And you brought enough people to make sure of it," Julian continued, "which tells me something." "What's that?" the voice asked. "That whatever's behind that door scares the men who sent you more than it scares me." The silence that followed was different this time. Tighter, less certain. The siege didn't break that night. No shots fired, no threats repeated. They stayed where they were, watching, waiting, because they knew something Julian now understood too. Once a secret required this much force to protect it, it was already failing, and by sunrise, someone was going to make a mistake. The decision didn't come with drama. It came with quiet. Julian waited until the night thinned, until the men outside grew restless in their positions. He could feel it, the subtle shift that came when professionals stayed too long without action. Fatigue bred impatience. Impatience bred mistakes. Inside the cabin, the air felt heavier than before. The chained door seemed closer now, as if the space itself had contracted around it. Julian stood in front of it for a long moment, listening. Not for sounds from behind the door. There were none. But for the echo of every warning he'd been given. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small bolt cutter. Old habit? Quiet tool? No theatrics. The first squeeze barely nicked the chain. The second bite deeper. The third snapped it clean. The sound was sharp in the stillness, metal screaming briefly before falling slack against the floor. Outside, no one moved. Either they hadn't heard, or they were waiting for proof. Julian pushed the door. It resisted, just as it had been designed to. He leaned into it, shoulder braced, muscles tightening. The hinges groaned, protesting years of disuse before finally giving way. The door opened inward. The smell hit first. Not rot, Not decay. Something colder. Preserved. Like a room that had been sealed with intention. The space beyond was smaller than Julian expected. Windowless, reinforced on every side. The walls were lined with shallow scratches, some overlapping, others desperate and singular. Dates had been etched into the wood. Names, too, some full, some reduced to initials, others scratched out entirely. Julian stepped inside. There were documents stacked neatly along one wall, wrapped in oilcloth. Photos tucked between folders. A recorder sealed in plastic. Evidence meant to survive time. Evidence someone believed would eventually be needed. He knelt and picked up a photograph. It showed a man seated in this very room, hands bound, eyes fixed on the camera with a look Julian recognized instantly. Not fear, but certainty. The certainty of someone who knew they had already been erased. Julian's jaw tightened. This wasn't a holding site anymore. It was an archive. A ledger of men who thought they could bury consequences the same way they buried people. Outside, a boot shifted on gravel. A radio crackled and went silent again. Julian gathered the documents calmly, methodically, as if he were packing for a meeting rather than dismantling a system that had survived for decades. When he stepped back into the main cabin, dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon. The door behind him remained open. And for the first time since this place had been built, what was meant to stay buried had been seen. Whatever happened next, the secret no longer belonged to the men outside. It belonged to Julian St. Clair now, and he had never been known for keeping things hidden. Julian didn't rush. That was the first thing that unsettled them. He stepped onto the porch holding nothing that looked like a weapon. No gun, no threat. Just a weathered folder tucked under his arm, edges darkened by time. The men in the trees shifted anyway. Weapons lifted slightly, fingers tightened. They knew that kind of calm. It meant leverage. "You should have walked away," one of them called out. Julian smiled faintly. "You should have read what you were hired to protect." He opened the folder and let the contents catch the early light. Photographs, names, dates. Not waved dramatically, just visible enough. Just real enough. "You were told this place was shut down," Julian said evenly. "Decommissioned. Forgotten." A pause. "It wasn't," he continued. "It was archived. Every transfer, every payment, every decision that kept people waiting until they stopped breathing." One of the men stepped forward now, closer than before. "You're bluffing." Julian slid a single photograph onto the porch floor with his shoe. It showed a meeting, a table, familiar faces. One of them belonged to the man who'd hired them. Another man swore quietly under his breath. "You weren't hired to protect a secret," Julian said. "You were hired to clean it up, including you." Radios crackled, voices whispered. The perimeter tightened, not around the cabin, but inward, toward each other. Julian kept talking. "There are letters, too," he said. "Plans, exit strategies, payments scheduled after tonight. For silence, for disappearances. Yours." He let that sit. "You think they'd trust men who've seen this place, who know what it was used for?" Julian asked. "You think you're walking away once the door's sealed again?" The man nearest him hesitated. Just a fraction. But that was enough. Julian nodded toward the folder. "I don't need all of you. I just need doubt." The alliances cracked quietly. A step back here, a weapon lowered there. One man turned his head, studying another too closely. The unity they'd arrived with evaporated under the weight of self-preservation. Julian felt it. The moment power shifted. "This ends one of two ways," he said. "You leave now, alive, with proof you were betrayed, or you stay loyal to men who've already decided you're expendable." Silence. Then movement. One by one, they pulled back. Not fleeing. Repositioning. protecting themselves instead of the secret. Julian watched them go, the folder still under his arm, the open door behind him breathing cold air into the morning. The cabin no longer belonged to fear. The secret no longer belonged to the powerful. And the men who thought they controlled this place had just learned the oldest truth in Julian St. Clair's world. Information didn't just buy safety. It decided who survived. Julian understood something in the quiet after they left. Power didn't end when the guns lowered. It only changed shape. He stayed at the cabin until the sun fully cleared the horizon, long enough to know the siege wouldn't return. Men who discovered they were expendable didn't rush back to finish someone else's job. They vanished the same way the names in his jacket had, quietly, urgently, alive. Julian packed the evidence with care, not to hide it, to aim it. By noon, calls were already moving through channels no one admitted existed. Not threats, not ultimatums, just confirmations, dates, cross-referenced names, copies released in fragments, never all at once, enough to destabilize, enough to make powerful people doubt who else might already be holding the rest. Exposure wasn't loud, it was surgical. 2 financiers froze assets they didn't know were exposed. A councilman canceled a flight that never reached the runway. A man Julian once considered untouchable disappeared into legal silence, surrounded by lawyers who suddenly stopped returning calls. Julian didn't watch from a distance. He walked straight through it. For years, his empire had been built on erasure. Problems vanished. Questions died. Silence kept the machine running. It had been efficient, profitable, empty. This was different. Now people didn't disappear. They folded. They testified. They defected. They protected themselves by dragging others into the light. The network collapsed inward, not from fear, but from visibility. Julian felt the shift in real time. Fear made people loyal. Exposure made them predictable. By the 3rd day, the cabin's existence was no longer a rumor. It was a liability, not because of what it was, but because of what it proved. That secrecy had been mistaken for control. That burial only delayed consequence. Julian returned one last time. Heavy machinery waited at the edge of the property, engines idling. No ceremony, no witnesses. He stood at a distance as the first wall came down, logs splitting under steel, the reinforced door collapsing into splinters that meant nothing now. The archive had already been copied, distributed, secured. The structure itself no longer mattered. When the dust settled, the land looked ordinary again. Empty, exposed, just soil and sky, the kind of place people passed without slowing down. Julian took one final look and felt something unfamiliar. Not regret, not relief, but clarity. The cabin hadn't changed him because it scared him. It changed him because it reminded him of a truth he'd buried along with everything else. Control wasn't about silence. It was about deciding what deserved to be heard. Julian St. Clair walked away without looking back, his empire already reshaping itself behind him. Leaner, louder, harder to hide from. Men who once answered to fear now answered to consequence. And for the first time, Julian didn't need to erase anyone to stay in power. The land was reclaimed. The secret was gone. And what remained was something far more dangerous to the old world than violence ever was. Truth released on purpose. If you stayed to the end, you already understand what kind of power lasts. Like the story, share it with someone who won't look away, and subscribe for more stories where silence breaks and consequences follow. Turn on notifications, because the next secret won't wait to be buried.